Australia is a country of millionaires. At least, that's what the headlines keep telling us. According to the 2025 UBS Global Wealth Report, 1 in 10 Australian adults now have a net worth above $1 million in US dollar terms. Sounds incredible, right? But here's the part nobody talks about. Strip out the family home, and that number collapses. It drops from 2.8 million down to just 1.1 million. That's a loss of 1.7 million so-called millionaires gone the moment you stop counting the roof over their head. So how many Australians are genuinely wealthy when their home doesn't count? And what does that mean for you? Let's start with the raw numbers. Total Australian household wealth hit $18.8 trillion by the end of December 2025, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The average household now sits on a net worth of about $1.66 million. Sounds amazing, until you realize where that money actually lives. Close to 75% of it is locked inside two things: property and superannuation. Households hold roughly $10.5 trillion in residential land and dwellings, and another $3.9 trillion in super. That leaves the average Australian household with about $573,000 if you remove property. Take out super as well, and it drops to around $197,000. And the December 2025 quarter proved this pattern is only getting stronger. Residential land and dwellings rose 3.2% in that single quarter, adding $368.6 billion. That alone contributed 2 full percentage points of the quarter's total wealth growth. Meanwhile, household borrowing jumped 2%, adding $64.2 billion in new debt, with housing loan balance growth at its strongest level since December 2021. So Australians are getting richer on paper, but they're also borrowing more against the very assets inflating their net worth. This is what researchers call asset-rich, cash-poor. You look wealthy on a spreadsheet, but in reality, you can't touch most of it. You can't pay your electricity bill with your house price. You can't buy groceries with your super balance, not until you retire. And the data proves most Australians aren't sitting on much cash at all. The average Australian has just $34,700 in actual savings, according to the Finder Consumer Sentiment Tracker. Compare that to the $1.66 million headline number, and the gap is staggering. Graham Cook, the head of research at Finder, put it simply. He said, Aussies have a huge amount of wealth tied up in illiquid assets. They're rich, but the wealth is inaccessible unless they take out a loan against their equity, and interest rates make that expensive. He also pointed to negative gearing and stamp duty as drivers of the problem. The government incentivizes people to invest heavily in property, which pushes up prices and feeds the cycle. Meanwhile, mandatory super contributions mean another 11.5% of every worker's income is locked away until retirement. Now here's where it gets really interesting. When Finder's wealth building report removed only the principal place of residence from the calculation, the number of Australian millionaires dropped from 2.8 million to 1.1 million. That's just 5% of the adult population. So 95 out of every 100 Australians do not have $1 million in assets once you set aside the home they live in. Think about that for a second. The whole identity of being a millionaire nation is built almost entirely on house prices. And house prices are exactly the kind of asset most people never sell. You live in it. You need it. It's not generating income. It's not funding your lifestyle. This is why the property obsession in Australia is a double-edged sword. Yes, it makes your net worth look impressive, but it creates a false sense of financial security. You feel wealthy because core logic says your house is worth $1.2 million. Meanwhile, your actual investable assets, the money that can work for you, might be a fraction of that. The UBS report confirmed that real estate makes up almost 53% of Australia's total personal wealth. That's higher than the UK, and far ahead of most developed countries. Meanwhile, the amount of wealth held in cash and deposits sits at just over 10%, which is the lowest among comparable nations, half of what you'd see in Switzerland or Singapore. And the wealth that does exist is not spread evenly. The top 10% of households hold 46% of all the country's wealth, with an average net worth of $6.1 million. The next 30% sit at an average of $1.7 million. But the bottom 60% of Australian households share just 16% of total wealth between them. That bottom group includes millions of people who own a home, who technically look like millionaires, but who have almost nothing in investable assets outside that property. So if most Australians aren't truly millionaires without their home, what separates the 1.1 million who are? The Finder report found three things. First, 38% credited consistent budgeting. Second, 12% said investing frequently made the biggest difference. And third, 9% pointed to paying off debt as the key habit that grew their wealth. The report also found that 85% of investors with over $1 million in net wealth earn interest on their savings, compared to just 48% of non-investing Australians. That gap is massive. It tells you that the real millionaires in this country have their money doing something, not just sitting inside the walls of a house. And this is the lesson. If you want to build real wealth, the kind that gives you freedom and choices, you need assets that work for you. Shares, ETFs, businesses, income-producing investments. Your home is shelter. It's important, but it's not a wealth strategy by itself. The generational data backs this up. 10% of baby boomers and 13% of Gen Xers own 2 or more properties. Only 5% of Gen Z do. The wealth ladder is getting harder to climb, and it's happening because the entry price to Australian property keeps rising while wages barely move. Superannuation balances tell a similar story. The median super balance for someone aged 30 to 34 is around $50,000. At 50 to 54, it climbs to roughly $168,000. These are important numbers, but they're locked away for decades for younger Australians. They don't help you build financial flexibility today. So here's the honest truth. Australia has about 1.1 million real millionaires, once you take the family home out of the equation. That's 5% of adults. If you're not in that group yet, that's okay. But now you know the real benchmark, and you know what the people who hit it actually did. They budgeted. They invested. They eliminated debt. They built assets outside their home. That's the game. And it starts with one decision. Stop measuring your wealth by what your house is worth, and start measuring it by what your money actually does. If this changed how you think about wealth, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.